So we are going to have a little continuation of the debate that we had last month. Some of you might have been there for last month. Quite a few probably haven't, so I'll fill you in on what we've been talking about so far for this group here. It's a fairly new group, so I'm changing the format every time that we come up here. This time I'm going to have maybe no more than a 20-minute presentation on the topic today. And then I'm going to divide us all into about 8 questions. I've got 5 questions I prepared. 3 questions that you guys can help make, and then I'll divide us out into those questions, and you can debate those questions in the various groups. I'll remove that, thank you. So, we probably haven't got everyone here either way, but I'm just gonna get started and slowly work out on this thing here. So, we are focusing on modern philosophy in these lectures here. The very first one started with Kierkegaard, because that's my favorite philosopher. Then went back to Descartes, up to David Hume, and now we are at Kant. And sort of the theme that we've been going on here is rationalism versus empiricism. Now, if you don't know what those two are, you can boil them down essentially to empiricism. You're mostly concerned with the outside world. I like to think of them as the philosophers that focus on what's going on outside themselves. And rationalism is more concerned with what's going on inside your own mind, if you will. That's one way you can sort of boil that down. And so, last time we talked about David Hume ripping up to shreds rationalism and Descartes, and giving the more empiricist view of viewing the world. And with that follows a few other notions like determinism, like not necessarily believing in free will. It's another Humean idea that we also went into, and seeing humans as basically clever animals rather than something close to God. That was also, it was very radical of Hume at the time, and we're talking 18th century Georgian era, still a very religious, fairly authoritarian era. It was pretty radical to be saying things like people are just clever animals, right? So that was written for you. And Kant spent a lot of his career reading up on Hume. He spent at least 11 years, according to his own words, he spent 11 years poring over Hume. So you don't read someone that long unless what they say deeply bothers you. And it deeply bothered Kant what Hume was getting into here. Because Hume had a very strong argument. He had some very, very strong arguments that we are mostly led by our passions. You know, he says that reason should be a slave to the passions. Our main drivers are those sort of primeval emotions, if you will. Those are the things that drive action, not pure logical thought as a rationalist would have it. And basically what Kant was afraid of was sort of a breakdown of moral authority. But he could also see that metaphysics, that philosophy needed to up its game. It needed to improve from what it had before, especially with the introduction of Newtonian physics, because science had made such impressive leaps into certainty, into rational foundations, that philosophy needed to keep up. And so both, you can actually see Kant and Hume as both trying to make metaphysics and philosophy a scientific affair, and trying to make it as strong as science. So they actually got a shared goal, but they have different ways of trying to achieving that goal. I won't talk too much about Hume because we covered him last time, but basically I'll just mention that Hume's way of trying to give the solid foundation for philosophy was trying to make it empirical and as empirical as science. So instead of having these grandstanding ideas about how humans should be, what they should do, what the ideal world is, he wanted to base his philosophy on what the world actually is. That was Hume, right? So he wanted to look at how human beings actually act, and then devise a philosophy from that, and then devise a moral theory from that. Okay, so that was his aim. And that's a very scientific approach of observing, you could almost call it the natural world, or observing how humans work, and then making your theories from there. However, there's a few problems that might emerge with that, and Kant definitely saw some of those problems coming. Problem number 1 is what Kant called reducing morals into a wretched anthropology.
reducing morals to a wretched anthropology. If you try to unpack that a little bit, what he means there is that the notion of morals and the notion of what is the right thing to do just becomes a question of time and place and where you are and who is telling you what's right and what's wrong. So if you follow Hume down this path, what is moral is just contingent on people's feelings at the time. So what is moral in, say, let's say China in the Ming Dynasty is completely different from what is the right moral thing to do in modern day France. Or let's assume Martians in Mars, just to take an extreme example there, right? Completely different morals because they're in completely different circumstances, and there's no binding element between them. And Kant wanted to go to the opposite extreme of that. He wanted to find moral rules and principles that apply to everyone, no matter what time or what place you're in, because he was afraid that it would become this very relativistic morass where there's not really any solid foundation for morals. It's just based on the majority, and it's just based on what is most efficient for you at the time. And you could see that might become a problem if moral groundwork is likely to change from day to day, right? And there's not a solid foundation to build on. So he wanted to make a solid foundation outside of the world that we perceive. And that's why Kant's solution to trying to make philosophy having more of a solid foothold is dividing the world up clearly into the world of science and empiricism and the world of moral frameworks. And he calls it the world of phenomena and noumenon. So phenomena is sort of the world that Hume inhabits, and that is the world where we are just animals, predictable animals. Scientific laws govern, physical laws govern cause and effect. And then there's the world of noumenon, that is the moral world that is not dependent on what we're experiencing in our life, that is sort of an outside realm. You can almost see it like a completely different world altogether, that's not bound by space or time. So in a way it reminds us a little bit of Plato and his perfect forms up there, his ideal universe, if you will, right? But Kant is trying to make it more sophisticated than that, and is trying to reconcile the empiricism of Hume with some of the ideals of religion and dogma, in a way, trying to make them support each other. Also, there's another problem. How can we talk about morals if we live in a deterministic universe? Right? Hume was definitely a proponent for, well, clearly Newtonian physics has proved that if you do A, it leads to B. We live in a determined universe of certain physical laws. If humans are bound by that as well, how can you talk about free will? How can you hold someone accountable if it was inevitable that they were going to murder someone on the street? And it's not really their fault, it's just the way they're programmed, right? If you think that way, having a moral framework kind of crumbles, right? It doesn't really make sense to talk about responsibility, talk about guilt, talk about you could have chosen something else because your choices were laid out for you beforehand. So that is another thing that Kant was worried about from Hume. And that's why he insists on the free will of humans and the way he can save this shipwreck of metaphysics that's about to crash on the shores of empiricism, or on the reef of empiricism, you might say. The way he saves that ship is taking out of that water and putting it in different waters altogether, and putting it in its own little sea, in its own little metaphysical world. So he tries to save metaphysics by dividing it up clearly into another world that we also rule by, right? A world that is based on first principles, if you will. So that is the metaphysical trick in a hat he's trying to pull here, Kant. And also, of course, if feelings and passions are the main driver for what you're supposed to do, and everything is just neat packaging of that, feelings are very fickle, right? People are unpredictable beasts, so how can you make a moral law based on that? That's also something Kant was worried about. So that's why he wants to
once again subjugate feelings to a higher moral law and have sort of a code that says, doesn't care what you feel, doesn't matter how you feel about a certain person, doesn't matter where you're from, what time you're in, you should always do this thing. You should always do these categorical imperative. You should also always follow, there are certain laws that you should always follow, and that is Kant's project to try and formulate those laws. And he did come from a strictly religious background, so that's why you'll probably smell some religious undertones here to Kant. You also have someone like Nietzsche, who gave the scathing criticism of Kant as being a sneaky Christian. Right? He was basically portraying Kant as someone who snuck in religious ideals under the veneer of rationalism, right? And that might be a fair argument. That might be a fair point, because he came from a very religious family, but he could also see that religion was falling behind the new world of materialism and science. So religion needed an update, if you will, or the moral laws that define religion needed an update to be able to keep up with the new scientific world and the Enlightenment. So that was part of his project too. So he was trying to make a new authority that's not a religious authority or a governmental authority. That people should think for themselves and be their own law unto themselves. That's one of the most important things of Kant, is trying to make people want to obey the law because they are the lawgivers themselves. And he's making this, you might say, slightly circular argument of you actually want to follow these laws, and you want to impose laws upon yourself because it's the only way you can be free. That's one of Kant's arguments, right? The only way to be a free, autonomous human and not be bound by the mean physical world, not be a simple animal in a way, is by governing yourself through laws you have imposed on yourself. And that is why, as a rational being, you would want to follow these laws, because otherwise rationality breaks down, and otherwise we are just reduced to clumps of matter, which nobody wants if they're a rational being. Sort of along the lines of that Kant's argument gets into. So basically, the lawgiver is rationality itself. And it's also a little bit, you can smell a bit of utilitarianism coming here, utilitarianism from David Hume, because it also makes a lot of sense to follow these laws, right? So one of the maxims, you might have heard the golden rule, that's sort of the watered down maxim of Kant, sort of, you should do unto others as you would have them do unto you. If you look at his original quote, or what he originally said, it's a little bit more, it's a bit different from that. It's very close. It's saying you should only will something if you would want it to be a universal law. Slightly different, close to being the same thing. Well, that's the thing. I mean, he tries to make it more sophisticated than that, because sometimes you may need to do harm in certain circumstances, but you can have a law that says you should never do harm under these circumstances, right? You would never want it to be a law that others can do harm whenever they want and just for fun, for example. And there's a great example of, you could take an example of a hitman who kills people for a living, right? Even he would be hard pressed to say, yeah, I would want it to be a law. I would want everyone else to kill everyone on the streets whenever they felt like. He would probably want everyone else to follow this law of thou shalt not kill, because it's in his own interests as well. But when he does the killing, he wants there to be a little exception for him in the moral law. That's sort of the idea. And when you do that, that's, according to Kant, when you break the law and you're actually not doing the rational thing. You're doing something that's very irrational, because it's both against your own interests, but it also demeans you as a human being. Some examples are also, there's another example of Kant, a very famous one. You should never use people as a means, but people should be an end in and of themselves. And the reason we should follow that law is because that's how you would want the world to treat you, more or less, right? That's the law you would want if you are rational, if you're not consumed by dark emotions, right? If you're able to get into that rational space, that is what everyone would want. So, he was devising a new metaphysics and a new moral theory. And in that way, as I mentioned with Hume, he was going in the same footsteps of Hume, but deviating from him. So he does want to allow for some things like sentimentalism. He does want to allow for the passions being important in making us taking the right moral choice. But instead of Hume that says, passion is up here, reason down there, right? Kant wants to flip the script and be like, reason and rationality is up here, but emotions can be helpful in steering you in the right direction. Your sense of sentimentality, your sense of, ooh, this feels wrong to do, can be a nice little thruster to get you on the right path to doing the law. But ultimately, it should be the law itself and your goodwill and your rationality that drives you to do the right actions. He talks about there is a priori and a posteriori as well. A priori are things you can conclude without having to rely on the empirical world. It's going a little bit away from the moral talk here, but it is connected to it because Kant wanted to make it possible to be able to make conclusions without relying on the outside world. And that's again that distinction between rationalists and empiricists. Rationalists try as hard as they can to be able to say certain truths about the world without having to rely on the outside world, with basically being able to just use their heads. And that's what Kant calls a priori statements, are things that we can know without having to go out and explore whether that's true. Examples of that would be the notion of time, right? You have to assume that for you to be able to conceive of anything else, you have to already assume pre-made that time is a thing. You also have to assume that substance is a thing. You have to assume that space is a thing, because otherwise you couldn't conceive of the table if you didn't already have the notions of substance, time, and space. So those are examples of things that are a priori. We know these things without having to go out and check. I need to see, is time a thing? Or I need to see, is substance a thing? And that is what he uses for his moral framework, to be able to undergird the notion that we can say some things about the world relying completely on rationality. So that is my very, very brief, quick breakdown here of Kant versus Humean theory. And I want to get into some of these questions here. So I've got 5 questions. Basically what I'm going to do, and I'm going to try and keep this presentation here real short. I might just have some questions come through here, and then I'll read out some questions that we can divide people into to discuss related questions to that. But I'll also take some suggestions for you guys for about 3 more questions, and then we can see how many people want to divide themselves for each question. All right? So, first of all, do we have any questions that I want to bring on the table here? Anything that you were sort of wondering about there?
Do you think he succeeded in proving the a priori versus a posteriori?
I mean, you have to accept his way of viewing the world, but if you accept his theory, then yeah, it makes a lot of sense, right? It makes a lot of sense to say, well, there are certain things that predates experience. You need to have a concept of certain things before you can take in experience in the first place. But it's also Kant has got this notion that we don't really have access to the things in themselves. Everything is filtered through the subjective lens. So we can never know about things in and of themselves. And that's why empiricism is so limited, because it can only tell us how we perceive things. And that's why you also need rationality to be able to have things that are pure ideas. That's what he calls it. Pure and unfiltered by empiricism, basically. But whether I think he managed to prove it, I certainly think he managed to set the order of the day. Because there are people that would continue Kant's project, and there are people that distance themselves from that. I mean, if you take someone like Hume, he would sort of have the opposite script on that, right? So he would be, these things that you talk about that are pure ideas and that are in your head, he would just call them impressions, I believe it is. So he made a distinction between between impressions and ideas. And ideas are sort of these vague echoes of real experiences that we've had. But it helps to see how the camp is sort of divided into 2 worldviews, right? One is one world, and everything else that is metaphysical and rational and up here in our heads is a little bit made up, or it's just a bit of a fantasy. Or you can adopt the other view, which is there's two worlds. There's the world of mind and rational thinking, and there's the world out there. And it helps you sort of decide which camp you're in, and then build on from there. But whether Kant was successful in his project, that's something that's still being debated in academic philosophy today, and a lot has gone ahead of Kant since then and tried to improve it. But you know, he sort of started the discussion, if you will, and set the order of the day. Yeah.
Yeah, I think maybe it's not the fact of proving it. In fact, it's quite a healthy way to live, not to be programmed by religion or the media, and to be
that's the idea.
To become a puppet or a hollow man.
Exactly.
In that sense, and Kant. I mean, I've always thought very similar to Kant. We've both been on the same page. And I have to say that living a life where you use reason and rational is a much healthier, rewarding life to have than the alternative which religion imposes.
Right, yeah. And that was his project as well, right? He wanted to make people think for themselves, dare to know, and sort of have a different authority that you could rely on that was more your own authority, your own volitional authority, instead of subscribing yourself to some other higher authority there. So yeah, that was very much in line with that project that he wanted to build. It also reminds me a little bit of, if you want to see examples of Kantian philosophy in action today, look no further than most schools, right? Quite often, if you got Timmy bullying the other kids because he's bigger and taking their toys, what will the teacher quite often say to him? Well, quite often one recourse would be, well, Timmy, you shouldn't take their toys. Timmy would be like, why not? I can do it. And then you could take the Kantian glasses on and say, well, Timmy, what if everyone did that? You wouldn't want that very much, would you? What if a bigger kid than you comes along and takes your toys? Then you wouldn't like it. So you should really try and be a bit more rational here and try and consider the wider world and how you might fit into that. And be a law upon yourself. They probably wouldn't put it that way, but that is an example of seeing Kantian moral theory in action, if you will, right? As soon as you start subscribing to...
What if Timmy says, this is a dog-eat-dog world, and if somebody bigger comes along, then so be it?
Well, then he's clearly Humean rather than Kantian, right? But it's just to give you an example of what Kant was trying to say and how it's still being perpetuated today. And I think that's pretty interesting, because usually we think of these philosophers as being lost and forgotten to time, but they're still permeating a lot of thought and a lot of ideas today that we just take for granted and are just subconsciously layered there, right? Okay, I am gonna open the table here for some questions and divide people out into groups discussing various questions. I'm gonna read them out loud here, and it'll also give you some time to suggest. I've got room for 3 other questions here that we can try and bring on. And then I'll write down those questions, and then we've got 8 questions that we can separate people out into. So the first question I've got here is, and you can think about whether you want to debate any of these questions, is it possible to be a moral human being without a categorical imperative, or i.e. a higher moral authority to subjugate yourself to? If so, how? Right? Can we imagine being moral without Kant's framework? So that's question 1. Question 2. Is it better to start with a moral principle and then attempt to navigate the world according to this principle? Or is it better to develop principles from what you experience? So that's a bit Kant versus Hume again. Which is the best approach? Should you first observe and then make theories based on that? Or should you make some groundbreaking theories and then try and mold the world according to that as Kant would like it? And then 3, where do we see examples of Kantian moral philosophy? I gave you one example before. Is it an outdated way of conceiving the world, or as relevant as ever? 4, what would a world without a universal moral law look like? And we've got 5, is it possible to talk about morality, responsibility, and guilt in a deterministic universe? Right, so those are some of the things that we've touched a little bit upon here. And I'll take some suggestions now and write with my horrible handwriting if we got some ideas for 3 other questions here. If not, feel free to think about it as we're sitting in the groups, and if you get an idea, feel free to come up to me, or I'll throw that question out.
I've got one.
Yes, go for it.
Is dog eat dog the way to go?
Do you think he's the truth master? He has the answer?
That's a terrible question. Sorry, no, I'm kidding. Is dog eat dog the way to go? Have we got as question for number 7?
How many we got now? 6.
Yeah, we got 6.
Do you cover his metaphysics or?
Yes, yeah, we've talked a little bit about his metaphysics. I've tried to keep the presentation here really brief.
What, do you have a question on his metaphysics?
Do I have a question? I've got 6 questions here that I'm going to divide into.
Are they also on ethics? Any on metaphysics?
Any on metaphysics. Not covering that terribly much now, so I haven't gone I've mostly got into morals with Kant here.
Then you can maybe ask, is the world a construction of the mind?
There you go. Is the world a construction of the mind?
The answer is no. You have got no idea.
And have we got a final question here? Yes?
We have something, what about positivism?
Positivism, yeah. What about it? What would be the question there?
What about his idea?
Ideas about positivism.
Didn't exist yet.
Well, you can say that positivism is leaning up against empiricism, and he certainly had ideas about that. So you can draw in there and try and compare it to empiricism, I would say, because he had plenty to say there. It was a little bit, I would say for Kant, it was a bit of a love-hate relationship, because he was trying to integrate empiricism into a new moral, rational understanding, right? But he didn't want the world to be ruled entirely by empiricism, because that would lead the way to relativism in morals, right? You can just pick and choose whichever morals suit you, sort of thing. So, now, I'm gonna have a little raise of hands here, and I'm gonna put people out into different corners of these questions. So we're gonna have question 1. I'll take you guys to be down here at the sofas. Is it possible to be a moral human being without a categorical imperative, or i.e. a higher moral authority to subjugate yourself to? If so, how? Can I see a show of hands? Is anyone gonna debate this question here? Maybe. All right, we've got 1. Okay, so we got 1 for that. Not a terrible lot. Got number 2. Is it better to start with a moral principle and then attempt to navigate the world according to this principle? Or is it better to develop principles from what you experience? Anyone got this question here? Number 2. I'm gonna put you guys... Right, let's see here. I'm gonna put you guys down in that corner. So I saw 3 show of hands there. And then 3, where do we see examples of Kantian moral philosophy? Is it an outdated way of conceiving the world, or as relevant as ever? Can I see a show of hands there, number 3? No one wants to debate that. What would a world without a universal moral law look like? That's question 4. Anyone want to debate that? There you go. I'll put you guys number 4 here. You can pick up the question from up here. And number 5. Is it possible to talk about morality, responsibility, and guilt in a deterministic universe? That's question number 5. So I want to debate that. We've got 1. Not a whole lot, so I might just not divide you out here. Question number 6. Is dog eat dog the way to go? Have we got anyone for this question there? There's 1. And then not a whole lot of others. And number 7. Is the world a construction of the mind? Who wants to debate that? We've got a few hands here. I'll put you guys for number 7 down in this corner. Right, so try and remember which corner you're going to, and you can pick up the question from here for the groups that are there. So I'll divide you out now to debate. Yeah.
How are you going to present our things after?